In this video, we are going to start working on Webpack. So, for you guys who might not know what Webpack is, what is it? It is a module bundler, module loader, bundler, transpiler, well, not really transpiler, but hooks into existing transpilers. It takes all of your resources, all of your assets. As you see on the left-hand side, it processes all sorts of different things, and it dumps it into other assets. It compiles them into, you have your images, maybe you do image optimization. It processes your CSS, it processes your JavaScript. It does it all, basically. And the key thing about Webpack, besides the fact that it will hook seamlessly in with Babel to allow us to write JSX code, but the key thing is it allows us to write different modules and require them from each other in a web environment, in a browser environment. Because what it does is it takes all your modules and it merges them all together into a cohesive goal or cohesive item. It'll obviously have to split the images apart into separate files, but it'll take all your JavaScript and put it into one file or two files or three or however many you configure, depending on your needs. It'll take your CSS and it can either, like I said in the last video, it can either inject the CSS straight into a JavaScript module, or it can be extracted into its own separate .css file for production builds. Fantastic tool, and you can see it in action, and I talk a lot about it in the Using Modern JavaScript today. Webpack has been largely the module bundler for browsers that the programming community has most invested in, or become most invested in, over the last couple of years, and it's a fantastic piece of technology. So yeah. Now, I know that there are things like JSPM, which uses system.js, which is a new standard that might be standardized one of these decades, that will allow native support of loading modules in a JavaScript application. So that would be great, once that gets around to being more mature and things like HTTP2 come out, or don't come out, but start becoming more widely used by web servers. And there's things like require.js as well, and browserify. They all kind of solve the same problem. How do you split your code apart into multiple files? If you've been a web developer who has not used a module loader or a module bundler yet in your career, you probably know how nightmarish it is to include dependencies, include files from one JavaScript file to another, because you have to put them all in script tags on the page, make sure it's in the right order. If you minify them, make sure they get minified in the right order, and then your globals leak everywhere, and it's just a complete mess. Well, Webpack solves all those problems. And it also, like I said, hooks into Babel. And by hooking into Babel, it will allow our JSX code to be compiled into JavaScript, because obviously JSX is not valid JavaScript. So as you see right here in the client.js, I'm importing a style sheet, a .scss file, a SASS style sheet. And that will be understood by Webpack, and it'll give me a bundle that will include those styles. So let's go ahead and get started. And again, I've covered Webpack before in previous videos. The last series that I did, where we put together that SyncTube app, and then in Using Modern JavaScript today, I talked a lot about Webpack. So I will show you guys what's going on with Webpack and kind of point out where what things do, but I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time diving into exactly what's going on with it. But you should be able to follow along even if you haven't used Webpack before. Let's start off by installing stuff. Usually that tends to be the first step that anybody has to do when working with anything even remotely related to JavaScript, and that is downloading some npm packages. I'm going to do this in kind of steps. I'm going to first do npm install node-sass. Whoops, stop that madness. Node-save. So node-sass is the SASS compiler for Node, but it actually includes a native binary of SASS-C, which is the C compiler for SASS. It's a SASS compiler written in C, and it's very, very, very fast. See, as you can see right there, it's actually downloading the binary pre-compiled. And it's a very fast, very efficient way to do SASS. Now, that doesn't have anything to do with Webpack just yet. Next thing, let's install Webpack itself. npm install --save Webpack. So this is the actual Webpack bundler. And by default, Webpack doesn't really do a lot. It comes with some stuff out of the box, But the vast majority of what we use Webpack for comes in the form of plugins and loaders. See, a loader is, in Webpack terminology, it's what's responsible for loading up, for example, this JS file that needs to be transpiled by Babel, or this SCSS file that needs to be transpiled by the SASS compiler. So next, let's do our loaders, and there's going to be quite a few loaders that we're going to need, so bear with me. npm install -- save. We're going to need the Babel loader. So we're going to install Babel - loader, and that is going to obviously process our JavaScript files through Babel. We're going to need the ESLint loader. That loader doesn't really do anything, as in it doesn't transform anything, but it will lint our code every time it gets recompiled and prevent recompilation in the case of an ESLint error. So we want that as well. We want the CSS loader because we want to be able to load CSS, but we also need the SASS loader. And the SASS loader is going to use the SASS compiler to take our SASS code, turn it into CSS. Then the CSS loader is going to take that and turn it into a style. Then we need the style - loader, which will take the CSS that got turned into a style, and the style loader is actually going to be what's responsible for presenting it on the page. Then we need a JSON loader. The JSON loader, not surprisingly, is for loading .json files. You just import a JSON file and it comes back as an object. Then we need, what else do we need? We need the URL loader. The URL loader is for if you need an asset, if you reference an asset through your CSS or your JavaScript file, you need Webpack to understand how to load that asset in and how to process that asset. And that's what the URL loader does. It allows us to reference external files. But the cool thing is it allows us to reference external files, but those files don't have to be in the public directory. I don't have to copy and paste them into public. Instead, I just reference them straight up on the file system, run it through the URL loader, and then what Webpack will do is when it generates the bundle, it will automatically copy that asset, that sound file or that image from the source file location into the target destination, into the target package destination. We also need the file loader. And those are our loaders. We need the Babel loader, ESLint loader, CSS loader, SASS loader, style loader, JSON loader, URL loader, and file loader. I told you there would be a lot of loaders, but those are what we're going to be using. URL and file are for images, JSON's for JSON, style, SASS, and CSS are for styles, and ESLint and Babel are for scripts. So make sure you grab all of those. And after we get all these loaders, we're going to need a plugin. So loaders are what process our code. Plugins do a lot of really fancy things. We'll see an example of one soon. I'm going to say npm install. I'm going to install extract -text -webpack -plugin. Oops, I forgot to -- save. The extract text webpack plugin is the thing I was telling you about earlier, where it will take, usually the CSS is compiled into the .js asset bundle thingy. The extract text plugin is used for production builds, and it'll take that CSS, that embedded CSS, and it'll dump it into a custom CSS file. Okay, now I'm going to install some dev dependencies. So I'm going to do npm install -- save-dev. And these dependencies are only going to be used in development. You might be noticing that I've always used -- save and not -- save dev so far. All of these dependencies are core dependencies for my application. And the reason that I'm doing that is when we publish this thing to Heroku, Heroku is actually going to pull down all of these dependencies and perform a build on its own servers, a fresh build at the time of deployment, compared to maybe you're used to pre-building all your stuff and then FTPing up the build artifacts. Well, that's not going to be how things work with Heroku. We will push up the repository, it will synchronize its dependencies, and then perform the build there. However, it will not pull down dev dependencies. So we have a couple things, a couple large-ish packages that are only ever used when we are actively performing development. And that is the react-hot-loader The React Hot Loader, fantastic plugin, or fantastic loader rather, and that's the thing that actually goes in and allows us to edit a React component in our JSX file or in our JS file. And we hit Control S, and then that component will change on our actual browser right in front of us without having to do a refresh. And then we also need the Webpack dev server. Now the Webpack dev server, I'll go ahead and hit enter because these might take a second. The Webpack dev server, fantastic tool that will serve out a Webpack bundle and keep it recompiled. It'll watch for changes for us. It will provide hot reloading for us. It'll do all those awesome things for us right out of the box. But these two things are only needed for our actual package, only needed for when we're actually doing development. The last thing I'm going to do here in this video is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to npm install -- save Lodash. And the reason I'm doing that is Lodash is going to be a library that we are going to be using quite a bit in this series. And I want to have an example of a vendor library. What do I mean by vendor library? Well, like I said earlier, Webpack can take all your JavaScript files and it dumps it into a single file. Well, sometimes that's not desirable. Sometimes you want to take your vendor dependencies, such as Lodash or jQuery or React or reactive JavaScript or whatever you have. Sometimes you want to split that into its own JavaScript file for performance reasons, because then when you change a file that's not in the vendor, that's not being outputted into the vendor bundle, Webpack will not have to recompile the entire vendor bundle. So I'm installing Lodash right now because that will be an example vendor package that we'll be able to use to test whether or not our vendor bundle is being generated properly. Okay, so if you want to get the version numbers of all the things that I've installed, I'll just take this and I'll scroll down. So we have Babel loader, CSS loader, lint loader, extract text Webpack plugin, file loader, JSON loader, Lodash, node SASS, as well as style loader, URL loader, Webpack, SASS loader, and then finally we have our two dev dependencies. And those are the versions I will be using in this series. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and leave the video here, and in the next video we will actually put together our Webpack configuration for our client code. And we'll see you guys then.